This is lecture number 3 for Philosophy 220, our study of ethics. And in this lecture, we'll be looking at how we can evaluate moral arguments.
Okay, we look at the form of a moral argument today before looking at how we evaluate a moral argument. A moral argument will always consist of declarative statements. You probably remember back in elementary school or junior high school for the very first time learning about different kinds of sentences. You have an interrogative sentence that asks a question, an imperative sentence that is a command to bring me a glass of water, open the door. Also exclamatory statements of surprise or of strong emotion. But our most common kind of sentence or statement is declarative. And it's the way we can define a declarative sentence is that it is a statement that can be evaluated as true or false. Doesn't mean that we may necessarily know if it is true or false the first time we encounter the declarative statement, but just the structure and the way that it is put together lets us know that this is the sort of statement that we will be able to judge as a true-false statement. Now, although we think of a conclusion always coming at the end of a moral argument, a conclusion can come at the beginning of an argument. The conclusion is the moral assertion that a person is making about a particular issue. And that statement of conclusion is supported by other statements, their premises, and of course their intention is to support the conclusion. Premises will sometimes be moral, some they don't have in nature, they don't have to be though. Sometimes premises are non-moral to simply provide information that will be used later to make a moral argument. And we'll look at the difference between the moral and non-moral statements a little bit later on. All right, we have two basic types of moral arguments, and they are the deductive and the inductive. A deductive argument has a decided conclusion and provides premises that attempt to validate the argument. And here's what I meant earlier when I said a conclusion can come at the beginning or the end of a moral argument. A deductive moral argument might decide to begin by telling you what the conclusion is, and then after telling you the conclusion, then go through the premises that can be used to support that particular conclusion. There's a sense of certainty that you have with a deductive moral argument that you will not have with the second type that we'll look at in just a moment. The deductive moral argument, because it is certain, can be described as either having valid or invalid premises. As you explore the premises of a deductive argument, of course, giving you what is its certain moral conclusion about a particular issue, you can examine those premises, and if they hold together well, then we call those valid. If they can be challenged easily, they would be considered invalid. And the more that the premises are considered valid, we then describe the argument as sound. An inductive argument explores premises in order to provide a probable conclusion. So your inductive argument doesn't begin with a conclusion already in mind, but begins to explore premises to see where the information that you're finding in these premises, to see where that information will take you. I think of an inductive argument very much like a story. You begin with meeting some characters and learning about what their lives are like, and of course the setting in which they live, and then you just sort of follow their story to see where it's going to lead, and you really don't know. An inductive argument is taking the information and seeing what will be a probable conclusion to a moral issue. Now, if the premises are strong, supporters of the conclusion that you eventually arrive, then the argument is said to be cogent. And of course, if the argument would not be cogent if we find that the premises are actually weak for the conclusion that is reached. Now, your textbook doesn't mention the gentleman pictured here, but I wanted to take some time to talk about him because he is very important to what develops in these inductive moral arguments as far as the notion of probability is concerned and how probability is related to knowledge. This is the 17th century philosopher John Locke. And Locke felt certain that anything that we have knowledge about, we have knowledge because we have experienced that through our senses, and we can do experiments that can validate this knowledge. But Locke also talked about probability as something that is very close to knowledge. Now, I have I believe it's three of you in this class who I actually know personally because I've had you in class lecture before. And so Jacqueline, Katrina, Elizabeth, if you're listening to this, when I had you in my class, John Locke would say, because I can actually see you with my eyes, I can prove your existence. I have knowledge that you exist. But now you're in this distance learning class, and so I don't see you. Now I do see your name on a class roll, and I can look on Blackboard and see that you've turned in an assignment. And so Locke would say, even though that I can't prove it by saying I see you with my eyes that you exist, I know you exist, he would say that there is a great deal of probability to my knowledge because of the past experience I have of seeing you, and now seeing you submit assignments and seeing your name on a class roll. Locke would say the probability of my knowledge, although it may not be as certain as it once was, it is still highly, highly likely. And so that's what Locke meant by probability, that even though we maybe can't prove something with the certainty that we once could, it doesn't mean that we've lost the knowledge. We can go to this theory of probability to show the great likelihood that that knowledge is still viable. Okay, let's take a look at the basic structure of moral arguments. The most common type of moral argument or moral statement that you will see consists of really two different phrases. One that is called the antecedent and one that's called the consequent. Antecedents are if statements. If such and such happens, that's the antecedent. It will be followed by a consequent. Then such and such will happen. So, our author presented us with a few kinds of moral arguments with the antecedent and consequent that are valid moral arguments. He gave you a great example of one that was invalid also. But let's take a look at first at a couple of these that are always valid arguments. Okay, first is modus ponens. And because we have just finished the conference championship games in the National Football League, and the Super Bowl is coming up in less than 2 weeks now, I'll use an example from one of the teams to set us up here to understand modus ponens. Okay, if Aaron Rodgers, who is quarterback for the Green Bay Packers, if Aaron Rodgers is healthy, that's my antecedent, then the consequent is the Green Bay Packers will win the Super Bowl. I know you may disagree, but stay with me for the sake of just argument here of seeing how logic works. Okay, and then part two is the statement, Aaron Rodgers is healthy. Now, we were just told in an antecedent that if that were the case, then what would follow is the Packers will win the Super Bowl. And so our last statement that continues with this logic is the Green Bay Packers won the Super Bowl. Okay, so hope that you can see what happens there with a modus ponens construction. The antecedent gives way to the consequent, and then we're told the antecedent is true, therefore the consequent must also be true. Okay, let's now look at a second type of valid argument, the modus tollens, and we'll stick with our same example here. If Aaron Rodgers is healthy, the Green Bay Packers will win the Super Bowl. Now, if we begin with a negation of the consequent, which is the Packers did not win the Super Bowl, then it also means that we must negate the antecedent. So that means Aaron Rodgers was not healthy. Okay? So modus tollens, we see the negation of the consequent also means the negation of the antecedent. Now, here's a very similar type of, or a group of statements, but here that we have an invalid statement. So let's see if you can see the difference here. If Aaron Rodgers is healthy, the Packers will win the Super Bowl. Okay, then we go to a negation of the antecedent. Aaron Rodgers is not healthy. Therefore, it follows the Packers did not win the Super Bowl. That's invalid. And the reason that's invalid is just because you negate the antecedent does not mean that the consequent will also be negated. It is very possible that there are thousands, millions of other antecedents that could have had the same consequence. So just because you take away one antecedent doesn't mean that there are not numerous other possibilities that could still bring about that consequent coming about. Okay, and then we were also introduced to syllogism. I've listed on this slide here the most well-known syllogism in all of philosophy, not just moral arguments or moral reasoning. Socrates is human. Socrates is the subject. The statement about him is that he is human. So now we take the statement about him and we make it the subject of the second sentence. Humans, all humans. Okay, now the subject, and of course the description this time is that they are mortal. What a syllogism is it is a simple connecting of the dots. If Socrates is human and all humans are mortal, it then follows that Socrates is mortal. And so when we have syllogism, we just have to make sure that we are connecting the dots. That is, when you move from one sentence, that there is the connection to the next, and then that there is a connection to the next. And this could go on for many, many sentences. And we just have to make sure that there is never a disconnect that comes in there, that we perhaps leap over a hurdle too quickly without making sure the connection is there. Now, we were introduced to hypothetical syllogism in the chapter for this week. So let me return to Aaron Rodgers and add in one more statement so we can see how syllogism is a valid argument. Okay, if Aaron Rodgers is healthy, the Packers will win the Super Bowl. And now let's say that if the Packers win the Super Bowl, Aaron Rodgers is going to Disney World. Now, syllogism means we can take the antecedent from the very first statement and tie it in with the consequent on the last statement because we connected the dots in that middle statement. So now, if Aaron Rodgers is healthy, and we can completely skip the Packers will win the Super Bowl and move right on to Aaron Rodgers will go to Disney World. So because of that common connection of the statement about the Packers winning the Super Bowl, it allows us to move from the antecedent of the first statement to the consequent of the last statement. Okay, there's two big weaknesses that can take place with these premises that we need to address. One was on that previous slide. Sorry that I've already moved to this one, but it's called implied premises, and it's very easy to understand, I believe. An implied premise means that it's obvious that the person making the moral argument has a particular premise that has very much influenced the conclusion that they have drawn about a moral or ethical issue, but they never have explicitly stated the premise. The reason that this happens is because oftentimes a person making a moral argument will simply take for granted that something they believe to be true, everyone else, including you, will also believe to be true, and therefore they thought it was not necessary to state that premise, and so therefore it's just an implied premise. You'll notice this take place in moral argumentation whenever you're following along the logic of the premises on a moral argument, and just there suddenly seems to be a gap. They jumped to a conclusion, or they jumped to what they thought was the next logical premise, and it obviously is not. So whenever we sense that disconnect, we really do need to stop and see if we can identify or come up with what that implied premise is that this person has just taken for granted everyone would believe to be true. Now, after the implied premise, the second most common mistake made in moral arguments is the lack of specificity in stated moral premises, in which someone takes what is considered a virtue or value by many and makes it universal or makes it applicable to all situations without considering the possibility there could be exceptions. An example here would be lying is always bad. Okay, lying is always bad. Most people would agree that in most situations, being false, lying, is a bad thing. But could there not be situations in which lying is actually not only not a bad thing, but the righteous thing to do? The example always used here, I believe first used by the ethicist Joseph Fletcher, was if you were to have a person in an apartment in Nazi Germany who is protecting Jewish children, and the Nazi SS soldiers knock on the door, and you have Jewish children hiding behind that door. When you open the door and see the Nazi soldiers and they ask you, are there any Jewish children here? What is the morally correct thing to do here? here? Well, if we have that premise that lying is always bad, we would say, yes, there are Jewish children here, and the Nazi soldiers would come in and arrest them and possibly execute them. But if we are willing to examine our premises a little closer and to make them more specific to situations, then we would perhaps see that in this situation, lying to the Nazi soldiers is actually the right thing to do. So when we become more specific, we sometimes will have an exception to some rules or what we considered moral laws. So just realize that that's also something that has to be addressed when we look at the premises. Now there are also non-moral premises that are these premises are trying to provide information that will help support moral assertions that may be made later in the argument. And non-moral premises must be more carefully investigated today than in any other time in our history. And this is because of the wealth of information that we have today. Not mostly because of the internet and all the resources that are there. The amount of misinformation and accurate information is all the more available also. Example that probably all of you know well, Wikipedia is a great website. It's a great place to get started sometimes on research. But Wikipedia, as much great information as it has, also has a lot of misinformation. And so you really have to be careful and double check your resources just to make sure you're being as accurate as you can possibly be in the premises that you are stating and developing your moral argument. Okay, this is the slide that took the most time to narrate on the last one, so I'm going to make sure that we got the recording going correct this time. Your author provided you with 9 great examples of bad types of arguments, and so I've got them listed for you here and would like to provide you with an illustration. And your textbook has some wonderful illustrations of each of these also. Okay, the phrase begging the question means to make a moral argument in which you are using circular reasoning. In other words, you're not using one statement as a foundation or support for another statement, but your two statements are codependent on one another. They're really saying the same thing. So take the statement, a responsible citizen should vote in a democratic society, and then turn around and say that your premise to support that is one of the duties of living in a democratic society is voting. All you've really done there is to restate the very same idea. The only thing that has happened is you've taken the word responsibility and you have exchanged the word duty in its place. And so a duty or a responsibility is really the same thing. So begging the question means that you certainly have something lacking here as far as support for the point that you were trying to make, because you've just stated the same thing using a different word or a different phrase. Equivocation is one that I think we see a lot today in the debate over gay marriage. Equivocation is when you take a word or phrase and the two sides that are opposing one another in a moral argument are using the same word or phrase, but they mean something very different by that word or phrase. And in the debate over gay marriage that we're having in our culture today, I think the side that is very much opposed to the legalization of gay marriage is viewing the word marriage as a religious word, and they have religious opposition to the concept of gay marriage. And so because their idea of marriage is steeped in a religious institution or is seen as a sacrament of their faith, then they therefore cannot separate that religious implication from the word marriage. Now, the other side may certainly, there certainly are very religious people on the other side of the argument, but their argument is, for them, marriage is not something that is being specifically defined religiously, but they want the legal right, the civil right to be married. And so they're viewing it from a civil or secular right, a basic human right that a gay or lesbian person should have, that heterosexual people have. And so there it is. It's the same word, marriage, but the two sides in the debate are perhaps meaning some very different things by that word. Okay, you also have the appeal to authority, and this is when you call upon a particular expert, and we have to be careful about that today because anyone can claim to be an expert, but we need to check the credentials of that person, make sure that they are an expert in the particular field they claim to be an expert in, maybe contact a professional organization that any expert in that field would belong to, see if they have hopefully perhaps published some articles in refereed journals from their particular field of expertise. So we do have to do our homework today to make sure that someone who's being appealed to as an authority truly is an authority in that field. The slippery slope argument, we could see someone making the claim that because they believe that McDonald's serves very healthy, unhealthy, and fattening food, that we need to recognize that McDonald's has become the Nazi gas chambers of American society. The people are going, and it's the same thing that was happening when the Nazis were marching Jewish people into the gas chambers. Now, a point could certainly be made. I think there is not just a cogent but very valid arguments that can be made about how unhealthy some of the fast food in our culture is. But what you risk in making a slippery slope argument, that what the slippery slope here is that you're moving all the way from saying this is an unhealthy this is a place that serves unhealthy food, and you're slipping already down the slope of saying it's the gas chamber of our society, a very sensational type statement, is that you're weakening the good work that you could do with premises of logically connecting the dots of the danger that you feel fast food poses to the health of our citizenry by quickly going down that slope all the way to calling McDonald's a Nazi gas chamber. Okay, we also have faulty analogy. I think a good example here is what we could examine Title IX legislation. If you're not familiar with Title IX legislation, this was really big in the 70s and 80s of presenting the argument that colleges and universities that have athletic programs need to make sure that there is equal funding for programs for women also, that they, whether it be volleyball or tennis or softball, whatever the sport may be, that the institution has a financial responsibility to support those programs. Now, many people that have been opposed to Title IX will say, but those programs don't bring in as much money. They don't bring in as much revenue. 85 to 90% of the university's revenue maybe, and for sports, may be coming in through the football program. So why should we give as much support to softball or volleyball for women? And so the kind of argument being used here is one of faulty analogy, and that the people will say, well, based upon a capitalist economy, we see that some businesses will do very well and they will grow, but a business that does not do well and provide customers what they want, that business will eventually fail and close. And so therefore, if the women's sports program is not producing enough revenue to support itself, based upon my analogy with capitalism, therefore the women's program should just be allowed to fail and no longer be part of the college or university. Now, the reason that's a faulty analogy is because you would be presupposing that the value that you have in the capitalist economic system, which is producing wealth, is the same value that should be held by the institution of higher learning. And one could quite easily challenge that analogy to say that they don't believe the greatest good of an athletic program at a university is producing revenue for the school. Now, someone could come in and challenge that and say they do think it is the most important thing about the athletic program, but it certainly cannot be taken for granted and therefore is a faulty analogy. We could also have appeal to ignorance. There are many people that have made the claim that they feel this is what's going on with the denial of climate change or global warming, that people have in ignorance equated weather with climate, and the two are not by any means synonymous. People looking at how cold this winter has been, or looking at the amount of snow that we had last winter and saying that climate change is not happening. Those scientists who are very much advocates of climate change would say that all the snowfall makes perfect sense, that when you have summers now getting as hot as they are, that the moisture is being pulled up into the atmosphere and therefore results in winter of much heavier snowfall. But the primary claim the scientists will make to try to overcome the ignorance of equating weather and climate is to simply point out that weather and climate are not the same thing. And any argument made to deny climate change based upon weather is an appeal to ignorance, because education needs to take place there so that people understand that there is a difference between climate and weather. Now, once a person has been educated on the difference between climate and weather, then they certainly could come forward and still make moral arguments denying the existence of climate change, but it would have to be done on different grounds than weather, because the fact that those two are not synonymous has now been shown. The straw man argument is to take a position that an opponent may have and to exaggerate it to the point that it's not even what the opponent was even saying anymore, and so therefore the argument becomes a straw man, because it's not even a true representation of what your opponent was saying, and you have used it to try to defeat that person's position. I think this happened when the opponents to Obama's health care reform started talking about death panels, and that was all based upon the fact that people who were terminally ill would have a chance to speak with medical experts about what their options would be in receiving particular treatment or medicine in the midst of their health struggles. And this got turned into a lie, a fallacy, that the government was going to create panels of experts who would decide when elderly people had lived long enough and it would then be time to put them to death. That was the whole scare tactic of the death panel. So that was a straw man. That was a bad argument. Okay, and then we also have the appeal to the person, and I've got two pictures on this slide here. These are two very polarizing figures. If any of you are really political, there's probably one of these people that you really like and the other person you can't stand. And maybe if you're more moderate, you don't have very strong feelings about either one of these individuals. But Michael Moore, of course, very far to the left politically. Movie maker, documentary maker, although some people would challenge if you could call what he makes documentaries. And Sarah Palin, very far to the right, a very polarizing figure also. And what I mean by polarizing is that these are individuals that people are either very attracted to what it is that they believe or what their convictions are, or they are very put off by these individuals. And so what we mean by appeal to the person being a bad argument is that rather than looking at the content of what Michael Moore or Sarah Palin might say, you simply agree with the person, or you completely disagree with the person because of who it is rather than what he or she is saying, rather than the content of the argument. And then lastly, a bad argument is hasty generalization. Some of you may have heard about a church or a group that claims a Baptist identity in Kansas. It's been disrupting funerals, mainly the funerals of United States soldiers who have died in either Iraq or Afghanistan. Now, pardon my language here, but I do want to be accurate, just to give you a little bit of a feel for this church or this organization. Their website is godhatesfags.org. And the reason that they protest soldiers' funerals and ridicule the family is that they say the soldier deserved to die because he is fighting for a nation that is being more and more open to gay and lesbian persons. And so therefore this was God's punishment upon America for being more open and affirming to gays and lesbians. Now, I am a Baptist minister, and for someone to look at what that group claiming to be Baptist is doing and then come to the generalization that all Baptists are like that, well, that would be a very painful generalization for me, because I'm a strong advocate of the gay and lesbian community and their rights. And so one group calls themselves Baptist, and here I also carry that label. And so to group everyone together because of a particular affiliation is certainly a bad moral argument based upon what we call hasty generalization.